Hello, and welcome to The Distillery. I'm your host, Harry Li Shanglun. I am streaming from the unceded lands of the people of the Kulin Nations. Today, I have special guest, Beth Eggleston. Hello, Beth. How are you?
Hello, so nice to be here.
I'm so glad that you're here, and I'm very excited to chat with you. Beth, you are a Fulbright scholar and also the co-founder and director of Humanitarian Advisory Group, which I'm really excited to find out more. What is it that you do in that context?
Well, it's so lovely to be here tonight. I'm coming to you from the Macedon Ranges, the traditional custodians being the Dja Dja Wurrung people. So Humanitarian Advisory Group, we are a bunch of hags, proud hags. We have re-embraced the term hag. We actually got a really interesting email when we first set up the organisation. Actually, it was from someone in government saying, have you realised what the acronym of your organisation? You can't go forward. And we said, actually, we're really proud to embrace hag, because in fact, if you go back to medieval times, hag actually sort of meant a wise woman of the village, or a woman with one foot in the village and one foot in the world beyond. So we decided that we would embrace our inner hag, and it's been the best marketing that we've ever done, really. So we started about 8 years ago now. We are structured as a social enterprise, so we are a business, but it means that if we make profits, we're able to put those into the humanitarian sector in areas where we may see that there isn't any funding, and we want to explore maybe something that's a little more edgy that traditional humanitarian actors may not want to do. But we generally see ourselves as a very small, high-functioning team that provides services for operational humanitarian agencies. So the United Nations, for NGOs, for the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, for government. And that could be anything from an independent evaluation to find out how someone's humanitarian program, how that actually went, did it have the impact that people wanted it to, but also looking at research, looking at training, and general sort of technical advice and policy development.
I think the imagery of the medieval wise woman with one foot in the world and one foot in the mystic arts or secret knowledge is a wonderful application of what you're doing. And you have quite a bit of experience working on the operational side with NGOs and other humanitarian organizations. Can you tell us more about the history?
Absolutely. So I've been very, very fortunate in having these opportunities. It's interesting, though, it's something I've been reflecting on a little bit at the moment. Often we do quite a bit of work with universities, and we talk with students who are studying international development studies and international relations, and they'll say, oh, how did you get into this sector? How did it start? And I guess it feels quite old school now, and it feels actually quite inappropriate, the idea of having to sort of volunteer for many years to get some runs on the board to finally get a job. And what a luxury that is, to be able to have the privilege to have been able to be a volunteer and spend that time doing that, when in fact, if you want to actually look at what the international humanitarian sector looks like and the makeup of that, I fear that entry point and having to volunteer is the result of that process. So I did volunteer for a few years, and then I was lucky enough to work with both local NGOs, local community-based NGOs, and then international NGOs, and also spent some time with the United Nations. And I was been very, very lucky to spend quite a few years working in Afghanistan, which is a place that is very dear to my heart. They've been having a really rough time, not just with COVID, but even in the last week with the blowing up of a prison and many inmates escaping and many people being killed. So I've had the privilege of being able to understand a bit around what a peace operation looks like when you have, blue helmets coming in and the whole sort of what people call the humanitarian circus coming to town, what that looks like, the coordination or lack thereof, but also understanding, I guess, behind the scenes when you hear a lot of criticism about organizations, or especially about the United Nations. And, we got used to that. You'd wake up every morning and the headlines would say, UN fails, UN does nothing, UN is useless.
Yeah.
Think, yeah. But actually trying to, when you get to see how the sausages are made, it's pretty hard work. And remembering that the UN it's member states. If they are not going to work together or have a sense of solidarity, then it's pretty hard to make things move forward.
I can't help but draw parallels with, I guess, something happening locally in Melbourne, where there's a lot of criticism of government response to COVID-19, as well as a lot of approbation to the swiftness of our national response. And I think in many ways, both are justified. Surely in your role now at HAG, Humanitarian Advisory Group, you must be able to balance really carefully that line of critique for improvement, and not letting it fall into kind of that critique for the sake of criticizing. How do you experience that on both sides of the coin now at your role as Humanitarian Advisory Group, and also when you were working with the UN, waking up to headlines that just lambasted you every day?
Yeah, that's such a wonderful question, because often I think a lot of this work is you actually putting things in place to ensure that something doesn't happen. And I actually saw a really interesting article today, which was, I can't remember the statistics word for word, but it talked about how the situation that we have now in Victoria and the restrictions that were put in place in July, the numbers of cases that has prevented. So if that had just been allowed to run its course, where we would be now. And I thought it was actually quite an uplifting article to thinking, oh, so the kind of hardships that we're all enduring now and the restrictions that we're having to go through, it was something like 30 or 40,000 cases that were prevented because of that, if things had just been able to run their course. And I thought, that's what we forget. We just sort of focus on where we are, and I understand that. But I think with humanitarian response, in particularly when it comes to preparing for a humanitarian crisis, if you do your job well, you don't get in the headlines. So
right, yeah, it's invisible.
Exactly. So it's not that tangible piece. And I guess that's why sometimes it's quite hard to get funding for those kind of activities. It's like when we talk about humanitarian action, there's, three main areas of that. So there's the humanitarian assistance, which is, is the water tanks and the tents and the kind of things you might see online or in pictures. But then the bit that we really focus a lot on is the protection part. It doesn't matter how well you provide assistance for somebody. They might have all the food and water and shelter they need in the world, but if they're not safe and if their dignity is not being respected, then you haven't done your job. And then the other element is advocacy, to ensure that you are advocating for people's rights and to advocate that this doesn't happen again. And I suppose all three of those are very relevant here. And I guess what is also interesting is when you look at what you see on the TV, if people are staying at home, the idea is, yes, that you're not seeing very much. So everyone's sort of gone to ground. But it's fascinating to see how we can learn what's happened internationally with a whole range of things. And of course, with this pandemic, because it's as a rolling kind of situation where different countries were responding at different times and very differently. And people trying to work out, why is that? Is it because one is an authoritarian government? Is it because one government is led by a woman? Why is that? And people are trying to join dots. And what's the magic formula? How come Vietnam's done so well? So we see all these different questions. And I think maybe it will be a real time now for learning between domestic emergency response in a range of different countries and what happens at the global level.
At risk of trying to do that exact thing that you just said everyone is trying to do, what are some of the lessons that you have taken away from your vast experience working operationally and more in an advisory capacity, in terms of like what really helps organizations and communities prepare and when you're talking about action in terms of response, but also protection and advocacy, there's a lot of preparedness in those latter two aspects. So I guess, what are the qualities that you think help in preparedness?
I think a lot of it is all about communities themselves being able to make the decisions that count. So I think often there are decisions that may be passed on to communities, which may be a little bit of window dressing. But I think really it's about, how do you ensure that, and again, trying to work out what is community leadership is always something pretty tricky, because there's always power differentials there. But ensuring people know generally what's important to them, they know what their priorities are, they know how best they can generally source the things that they need. So I guess it's trying to, I think, look into the future and try and work out what might happen and how might communities respond. And it has been interesting, and I don't want to by any way, shape or mean sort of belittle the situation that's happening in Victoria at the moment. I have been thinking, however, about how this question of resilience, and people have been saying, I wonder, is my community resilient? Because we haven't really had to face that many hardships, but depending on where it is. So, for example, wouldn't it be interesting to know, although they have had such incredible hardship over the last 6 months, but, bushfire-affected communities, I wonder if, because they had to show such strong resilience at the beginning of the year, if they just have bounced back because the community networks are there, they know who they can lean on, they have those networks and supports. And maybe it's communities that have not had to face really anything in living memory that may be the ones who are grappling to work out, where do I plug in to get help? Or what are the structures? Hang on, if I wanted to set up a food bank, where do I do it? And maybe it's in those kind of communities where you see organisations that in the past were very involved, perhaps religious organisations or other community-based organisations, that are now stepping forward, and people are thinking, oh, that's right. Yeah, I hadn't thought to be a member of that group, or I hadn't thought to access help there. So I think it's elevating that, but there's an element of accountability which I think is interesting. I think this is always the hardest piece. I know from an international point of view, trying to be accountable to an affected population, very, very diverse needs and priorities. How do you actually set up mechanisms, which are not just to do with social media, where people can say, this response is not working for me. Either I haven't been reached, I haven't been consulted, nothing that you gave me worked or was appropriate. In some countries you've seen, loads and loads of rice being given out, and then people said, I didn't have a pot or potable water to cook that. I can't just eat the rice unless it's cooked. So all the kind of infrastructure that goes around that. And I think it's not the magic bullet, but I know that it's well recognised that we have to listen to communities, but it's very hard.
There was so much, and there was a really rich response. Thank you. So just trying to distill it and unpack it a bit, pointing to the idea that we absolutely need community leadership and listening to community leaders, even as identifying that might be difficult. And you're saying that the communities, or even the organizations that have maybe a longer memory for times of crisis, may be more equipped and prepared to step forward in this particular crisis of COVID-19. And I'm reminded, you mentioned maybe church communities, and I'm thinking also about hearing from Cassie Lynch in the refuge talks, and she mentioned that First Nations people are particularly well equipped, and that's kind of what we've seen from various Aboriginal communities, that they're actually their response to COVID-19 has been stellar, again because of that deep memory of different pandemics that are passed down through oral history.
Absolutely, many.
And so I guess the crunch for you is to figure out how to create structures and mechanisms to allow those people to feel like they are a part of the response and actually being listened to and heard. Is that fair to say? And just trying to pick apart what you said?
Yes, exactly. And you're right, because it's not just being listened to, it's feeling like they've been heard as well, because they may have been listened to, but you need to have that feedback, that the information flow shouldn't just be one way. There's always a big emphasis on pushing out information, and that's important to an extent, but it has to be a two-way communication.
Really great. So I mean, COVID-19 doesn't affect just some portions of the population. It does affect people differently, disproportionately, but you are somebody who's running a small business, a social enterprise, in the midst of a global pandemic. What has that been like?
It's really interesting, because we have an incredible team. So we're a small team of 11, and we were very fortunate because we already did a lot of our work remotely. So the way that we'd set up the business, because both my co-founder, Kate Sutton, and I live some way out of Melbourne, so we deliberately set it up so we only had to come to the office once a week. That's how you set it up when it works for you. So it means that the rest of our team also work remotely, and we would sort of converge in the city on a Thursday and have all our meetings and all our chats. That obviously hasn't happened for quite some time now. So it's been interesting seeing the ebbs and flows of the team, I think, because they've all worked in, crisis situations. They've worked in many different places, many places where they didn't even have good, internet or technology to support their work. And they sort of really, when things first locked down, they just really worked and worked and worked and worked and worked. And, we still had a lot of deadlines, all this kind of stuff. We were interacting with a lot of different aid organisations. And so then we got to the point when the first sort of lockdown lifted, and we decided we would do a trial on actually having a 4-day work week. So keeping everyone on full pay and saying, let's have a 4-day work week we did that for June, because we recognised that everyone was sort of starting to, to lose momentum. So that went well. But I do feel like when the second lockdown came in, there was just a feeling of flatness in the team. And it is that feeling of, of sort of frustration, because we're a very close team, and it is hard not to be able to reach out, directly and have those one-on-one coffees and find out how people are. So we did a series of surveys with the team. We've really trying to elicit different kind of wellbeing strategies that we can put in place. Trying to learn a lot from other organisations, and also trying to ensure that the work that we're working on every day, we were able to pivot some of that work to ensure we felt like it was super relevant, not just for the humanitarian sector, but it felt relevant for us too. So, for example, we did a guidance note series for operational agencies, but focusing on remote work practices, focusing on remote facilitation of humanitarian teams, and focusing on, remote evaluation and monitoring, because we recognise suddenly that, people can't move around. That's not just international aid workers. It's if you're in any country, you may not be able to get to a whole range of different areas of that country to sort of look at how humanitarian programs are rolling out. So we've been able to use some of that within our organisation, which has been really nice. And I suppose we've also spent this time a little bit of reflection as well, trying to work out, okay, we've been really, really busy. Also, let's try and focus on kind of nourishing ourselves as well, and nourishing the business. So we've been overhauling a lot of our policies and procedures, really making sure that the organisation is moving in the direction we want it to. For example, we're putting the finishing touches on a human rights policy and other elements to kind of go above and beyond how we hope the organisation to operate.
That's fantastic. And I think, a lot of people are experiencing, either individually or on a business scale, that period of reflection and kind of, interrogation with the slower pace, with the maybe lack of energy or loss of energy that you're mentioning. So it's really wonderful to be able to say, okay, let's take care of our team, nourish ourselves, think really critically about what is meaningful work and how to keep that relationship with work something positive. I think that's wonderful. And I guess, like, being a social enterprise, you're saying that any money that you're making, you can pour into the more edgy kind of thing. That's what you mentioned earlier. I'm so curious. I wanted to ask, what does that actually mean? What are the edgy approaches to humanitarian response?
In the past, so I'll tell you a couple of the things that we did before COVID, and then I'll tell you a couple of things we did in response to that. So, in the past, we did a couple of pieces, and there are one's a little bit technical, but we had one of our fantastic team members, Josie, pulled together a piece. And this was after there was a big scandal that some of your listeners would have heard about in terms of Oxfam globally. There was a sexual exploitation scandal in Haiti. And as a result, there was a real taking stock of international humanitarian agencies, and really an outpouring of horror, not just from the international community, but also for agencies. More and more stories just kept coming up, not just from Oxfam, from many different agencies. And so we decided, well, let's actually, we've heard about how terrible this is. Let's do a piece that looks on what are safeguarding initiatives looking like at the moment. And there's incredible range of initiatives, from particular, blockchain apps that ensure that child protection policies were up to date and, threw you red flags to be able to let you know if anything had happened with any of staff members. There are a whole range of different things that really looked to the future and how we can try and address issues like this. And we also did one that looked at how we could actually have a mechanism in Australia on, instead of every different NGO putting up their hands saying, when there's an appeal, oh yes, go to our website and donate here, and looking at something that like the UK has, and actually many other countries around the world, where there's one phone number, one website, and you put the money and it goes into a pot, and all those different humanitarian agencies from that country can access that funding and then do the programming wherever it may be needed. So that was a little bit of a sensitive one because everyone has a different market share in Australia and no one wants to sort of let that go. So we did bits and pieces on that. And really post-COVID, what we were really concerned about, I suppose, was we knew that the pandemic was going to be serious, but we thought, what's also going to happen if we have a really large humanitarian crisis in the midst of that? So if you have, a massive undersea earthquake and a tsunami, or a really, a Category 5 cyclone, and we have seen this since the pandemic hit, and we were trying to work out the humanitarian system and the mechanisms that we have, what's that going to look like if you can't have particular assets being flown in, particular assistance, and sometimes technical expertise as well. So since then, we wrote a paper on how Cyclone Harold unfolded in the Pacific. So this was a couple of months ago, and the question was, we've always talked about local leadership, community leadership, and, governments being able to lead their own response. What will happen in, for example, Vanuatu when this huge cyclone comes through? Surprise, surprise, they survived. The response went on without the white international aid workers riding in on their trusty steed. So it was great to be able to unpack some of that. And we did. We have a wonderful national consultant, Linda, in Vanuatu, and she was able to help us with all these interviews to get that data to find out there's an evidence base, actually, that if you can shift resources from here to places like Vanuatu, they are able to manage these responses themselves. We just need to work out to be able how to listen properly and be able to really take the priorities seriously when various governments, regional groupings or organisations can, let us know what they really need.
That's really brilliant. It sounds, the one that struck me earlier of having a big pot of funding that the different groups can pull from versus the current situation of a fragmented market share and all vying for attention and resources feels almost like an ideological split between capitalism and communism or something. Like how do you shift from market forces towards a more social or communal oriented model? And then this latest, the later example that you gave of compounding disaster and crises, which is such a real thing, right? Like COVID doesn't care. It's not gonna wait or magically disappear because a cyclone comes along. And the numerous remarks that you've made, I can't help but notice of, I guess, the image of the old mode of humanitarian aid. And we were making a few jokes about it, say calling it a circus or saying, here's the white savior on the noble steed. I guess I'm particularly interested just to dive into that a little bit more. What are the harms caused by this old model that we keep kind of jokingly referencing? And what's the new way forward? What do you hope for the future of this sector?
Well, this is such a timely question. It really is, because I think there has been some serious self-reflection of the sector in the last, 12 weeks in particular. And there have been some fantastic online events talking about white supremacy and aid and decolonizing aid, and that very real, difficult and much needed conversation that needs to be had about, how many people who are receiving humanitarian assistance are reflected in the leadership of organizations who provide it, who are making some of these decisions, who are the voices that we're listening to. And it's just been incredibly, it's very complicated, but it's also just, I think we're just grappling how to have the conversation, I suppose. It's so stark that things need to change. I think that goes without saying. But then I feel like we've known that for a long time and still nothing has changed. So it sort of feels like we've got to a point, but where to from here? So I think that whole idea of shifting power, of inclusiveness, of different perspectives actually sitting around the table. And I guess what makes it even more sort of chilling is agencies talk a lot about this. It's all about inclusiveness. It's all about gender. It's all about understanding complexity. It's all about a unique context. And then we just goes on through.
It's just like an empty rhetoric.
Continues. So I sort of,
and
I've talked to lots of people in NGOs they're really aware of it, and they'll just sort of say, for example, when it comes to localization, how are we empowering, our partners who we work with in these countries to to be leaders in this way. We understand that the way in which we're working at the moment is not supporting that. But I think people sort of feel like, how far back do we need to go? Which kind of level of policy do we need to rewrite to actually see change? Because I think a lot of people are very well-meaning and are very keen to, okay, we really need to have a shift. But I think people do feel a little at a loss of where to start. It's such a big thing, and I mean, and it's systems change. It really, the whole thing needs to shift. And I think, yeah, there is a feeling of like, we know, what now?
I think that's such a resonant thing across so many different industries. Now may be the time of supposed reckoning, where a lot of things are coming to the light, but actually these truths have been known for many, many years. And a lot of the efforts in responding to them are lip service. So how do we move past that to affect real change? Oftentimes it involves a bit of like structure or kind of a real reversal of power. Thinking about how to achieve that, though, functionally is, at least for me, really like interesting and
how
tricky.
we can be honest about it. How can we? So I'll give you an example where we've been doing some work with a range of different humanitarian actors looking at diversity and inclusion in humanitarian leadership. So we've developed certain tools that leadership teams can use. So we decided, okay, let's trial the tool on ourselves, our team, and we're going to publish the outcome. I haven't seen the outcome yet, but we've decided that we're going to publish whatever comes out of that tool in our annual report, so that people can see, we developed this tool and this is what came out, and these are maybe the areas where we're going to work on for next year. And we'll let you know if we didn't get there. We're going to let you know. But I think perhaps there's also a lot of competition in the aid world, competition for a shrinking pot of funds. So we don't share a lot when it comes to lessons and tools and ways of working. And we're not very good at publishing our failures and letting people know this was a disaster. Don't do this.
Yeah. So competition is making it a little bit more cutthroat, maybe.
Absolutely.
Also, I recognize that I'm lagging, so sorry if I cut in halfway through a question. I also just wanted to briefly bring up something we talked about in the pre-show, which is that talking with Helen Berentz a couple of weeks ago about the politicization of children and the way that the imagery of suffering and death can be used in different ways. And I really liked your response to that. What are your thoughts on how we choose to portray marginalized people?
Yeah, this is something, at HAG, we feel quite passionate about this. And under the Red Cross Code of Conduct, it states very clearly that anyone from a vulnerable population should not be portrayed in a way that they are lacking dignity or agency. They should not be portrayed as a hapless victim. We do still see this, though, on our television screens of people, there's a small child with flies around its face and sort of, send money now. Yeah, and hopefully we're moving on from that. So we've even got to the point now, even though we're doing reports about, different contexts and different emergencies, that we've just moved away from having any kind of imagery like that. And I know that, for example, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, they have very clear guidelines about not using images like that in any kind of work that they fund, which is fantastic and moving in the right direction. But I do wonder, it still seems to be, and I guess perhaps because of social media and our hunger for images. And I guess there was that very strong image. It was a few years ago. Do you remember that little 3-year-old boy who had washed up, I believe.
Washed up on the beach, yeah.
Yes, and there was a feeling, some people sort of saying that shouldn't have been released, and others saying this is going to change things. We may see real change. So there is tension there, but that image is still burnt in my mind.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on with the power of images having the capacity to change on an emotive level, which I think on one hand I understand the storytelling and arts practices are kind of the way to change people's hearts and minds. Give them a bunch of facts and it's still kind of a big barrier and tough to consume. On the other hand, as you've mentioned, it can be quite harmful. and maybe not the right direction to go. So it is heartening to hear that at various levels of government and organizations, there are commitments being made to do better on that front. Beth, thank you so much for joining us and chatting about your passion, expertise, and work. It's been such a pleasure.
It's always a pleasure talking to you. So anytime.
Awesome. Do take care and all the best during the pandemic.
Take care. Bye.
That was Beth Eggleston of the Humanitarian Advisory Group. And I'm Harry Li Shanglun, host of The Distillery. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. We do have new episodes coming out, so do check back every once in a while on our website, which is distillery.site. And you can check out all the previous episodes as well. And follow us on Instagram at distillery.site or on Twitter at distillery_site to find out more about our upcoming guests. Thank you all so much. Sorry, I've just seen this question from Elliot, which is, to what extent have NGOs localized their emergency response, base funding on clear and demonstrable localization of programming and emergency responses, as well as this lovely comment from James Ritchie saying, great conversation. Sorry that we didn't get around to answering the question, but thank you so much for tuning in, everyone, and catch you all next time. Take care.